Superman 2 changed directors 3/4 of the way through its production from Richard Donner to Richard Lester, and then 20 plus years later, Richard Donner got to release as best he could his original vision for Superman 2. So, which cut was best? Welcome to the Summer of Superman, and hopefully you can join me on this journey through Superman's theatrical roller coaster ride. In the previous video, I looked at Superman the movie from 1978, in which I looked and discussed a lot of the production behind it, in which I did mention they were filming Superman and Superman 2 back to back, but then 75% of the way through filming Superman 2, they decided to stop so they could just solely focus on finishing the first film. Which leads us to today, where we get to look at Superman 2, a film that famously has two distinct versions. Superman 2 started filming in 1977 since it was originally planned to be filmed back-to-back with Superman from 1978. As discussed in my previous video, tensions rose heavily between Richard Donner and the producers of The Salkins and Pierre Spengler. Richard Lester was brought in to help mediate tensions between Richard Donner and the producers, as he had previously worked with these producers on The Three Musketeers. The funny thing is, Richard Lester had actually previously and successfully sued these producers for owing him money on movies that he had directed and made for them. However, that money that was owed to him was tied up in legal jargon and other assets. And so as a way to repay and recompensate him for what they owe him, the producers brought in Richard Lester and made a deal where he can come in as a second unit director for Superman and Superman 2. He ended up not necessarily wanting full credit for Superman because he thought of it more as a Richard Donner project. However, Richard Lester never really helped alleviate tensions between Donner and the producers, and so Superman 2's production halted after 75% of it had already been filmed. However, after the success of 1978 Superman, Donner was not initially axed or fired from Superman 2. However, he said that if Spengler specifically, but the producers in general, were involved, then he would not be. And then there were some other hiccups, as Marlon Brando sued the producers for not paying him his percentage of the film's profits, and he filed for a restraining order to prevent them from using his likeness in future Superman movies. Marlon Brando did technically win the lawsuit from a financial side of things, however, he was not granted a restraining order. That being said, the Salkins decided not to use his scenes that had already been filmed because they did not want to pay him Superman 2's profits. And another third hiccup that almost derailed Superman 2 was the fact that Richard Lester, who was originally going to be planned to replace Richard Donner, was unavailable because he was filming a 1979 film called Cuba. But fortunately, production on Cuba had finished right before production on Superman 2 was about to restart, so Richard Lester could return, but this time as the full credited director. Now, some of the cast and crew left the project out of loyalty to Donner, one of which was creative consultant Tom Mankiewicz. And so needing to replace Marlon Brando's scenes, as well as needing new footage so Lester can get enough percentage of the filmed footage to be credited as the director, the producers brought in David and Leslie Newman to help write a new opening and a new ending for Superman 2. So with all of these behind-the-scenes shakeups in Superman 2, the biggest one was about to almost happen. During the production shutdown of Superman 2, Christopher Reeve took on a role in a romantic film, Somewhere in Time. and his contract for Superman had expired during the duration of the production shutdown. Reeve had reservations about the departure of Richard Donner and the new story that Lester and the Newmans were going to use. However, they did eventually come to an agreement, but during the renegotiation, Christopher Reeve was given a lot of artistic control over his character, that being Superman. So now let's fast forward to 2001. While making a DVD restoration of 1978's Superman, 6 tons of footage from every Superman film was found in vaults, including Richard Donner's original footage for Superman 2. That gave birth to the idea of Richard Donner finishing his original vision. However, some issues still arose because the Salkins still legally owned the footage. The use of Marlon Brando's likeness was still in doubt, and Richard Donner was reluctant to return to the project because of his previous experience. Eventually, though, those issues were resolved, and the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2 was released in November of 2006, on the same day that Superman Returns got its home video release, and it was included in the Superman Ultimate Collector's Edition, which is the first collector's edition I ever owned. Through all of its production hell, Superman 2 ended up with 2 very distinct cuts. So which cut is better? Looking at the cast, it's pretty much the same as 1978 Superman, with the exception being that Marlon Brando is not in the theatrical cut. He is in the Richard Donner cut, however. And then Sarah Douglas, Jack O'Halloran, and the great Terrence Stamp return as Ursa, Non, and General Zod, but their roles in Superman 2 are much, much larger than they were in the previous film. Valerie Perrine returns as Eve Tessmacher. Ned Beatty returns as Otis, but luckily this character is written off pretty early on. I did not like him in the first movie, is one of my only 2 real problems with the first movie. And then you have Gene Hackman returning as Lex Luthor. However, in this version, it's a little unclear whose side he's primarily on, because he does what's best for him. Sometimes what's best for him is siding with Superman, sometimes it's siding with Zod. Margot Kidder returns as Lois Lane and really gets to shine even more in Superman 2 than she did in 1978 Superman. Both Margot Kidder and Christopher Reeve have better performances, in my opinion, in the Richard Donner cut, since it explores their relationship much more dramatically, whereas Richard Lester's version takes a lot more of a romantic comedy approach. Now, the story overall is pretty much the same in both cuts. However, they do have very different openings and endings, and the way they explore Clark and Lois's relationship while they're investigating the honeymoon suites in Niagara Falls, they explore that very differently as well. The opening of the theatrical cut sees Zod and associates getting sentenced to the Phantom Zone, with Jor-El being cut out of the scene. And then you fast forward and Superman stops terrorists from bombing the Eiffel Tower in Paris, which leads to Superman throwing the bomb into space, causing an explosion in space that destroys the Phantom Zone and releases Zod and associates. However, in the Richard Donner cut, you see Zod and associates get sentenced to the Phantom Zone. However, Marlon Brando's Jor-El is present in the scene. And then you fast forward and it shows a replay of the end of 1978 Superman, wherein he throws one of Luthor's missiles into space. And that is what causes the Phantom Zone to explode or destroy, which releases Zod and associates. Personally, in terms of the openings, I prefer Richard Donner's cut, mainly because it directly connects to the previous movie, which makes Superman 2 feel a lot more epic, because it makes it feel like you're watching a continuation within a 4-hour story rather than just starting anew with a 2-hour story. Before we get to the endings, let's look at some other differences, some of which include extended scenes between Luthor and Tessmacher as they're in the hot air balloon and while they're exploring the Fortress of Solitude. Primarily, they're mostly the same scenes, just extended, because almost all of Luthor's and Tessmacher's scenes were filmed before they halted production. So all of those scenes were pretty much the same in both cuts. However, the Richard Donner cut, they extend the scenes a lot more. So you get a lot more dialogue and a lot more like quippy jokes. To me, it just felt like I was watching kind of an extended version of the same movie when those scenes were happening. It didn't change my overall experience that much. The major differences in the film revolve around Lois and Clark, and the story of how Lois discovers Clark is Superman. In both versions, they are tasked with investigating a honeymoon racketeering scheme in Niagara Falls. However, in Richard Lester's version, the honeymoon suite scenes took place in an over-the-top romantic comedy version of what a honeymoon suite looks like. You get a vibrating heart-shaped bed, a jacuzzi, a really large fireplace, whereas in Donner's version, they're pretty much in more of an intimate setting and more of a generic hotel suite. Story-wise, in the theatrical cut, Lois starts to think Clark is Superman after Superman randomly appears in Niagara Falls, which is miles away from Metropolis, right at a moment when Clark is mysteriously and conveniently absent. So to prove her point that Clark is Superman, Lois jumps into a raging river. However, Clark finds a clever way to sort of save Lois without making it look like he saved Lois by shooting his heat vision at a branch that conveniently falls for Lois to grab onto as she floats to the shore. However, Lois does eventually find out because Clark clumsily trips into the fireplace, and Lois realizes he has 0 burns on him and is not hurt at all. In the Richard Donner cut, from the very beginning of the movie, you kind of get inklings of it even before they make it to the honeymoon suite. You get Lois looking at a newspaper photo of Superman, while Jimmy Olsen mentions that Clark always seems to miss seeing Superman. She then picks up a pen and pencils in glasses over the picture of Superman and pencils in a suit and hat on the Superman picture and realizes it looks a lot like Clark Kent. And to prove her point, she decides to jump out of the window of the Daily Planet skyscraper. However, much like the theatrical cut, Clark finds a clever way to use his powers to save Lois without actually making it look like he's saving Lois. And he saves her without even having Superman appear. In terms of the scenes where Lois tries to prove her point, but Clark finds a clever way to save her without becoming Superman, I do prefer the Lester version. I just think it was a little ridiculous to just have her jump out of a skyscraper and to not have her think that someone was there breaking her fall, because clearly she would have died. However, once you get to the Niagara Falls side of things and the overall story and scenes between Margot Kidder and Christopher Reeve and between Lois and Clark, overall I do prefer Richard Donner's cut. Because while in the theatrical cut, she kind of just randomly stumbles into the fact that Clark is Superman because he clumsily trips into a fireplace, in the Richard Donner cut, it makes Lois look extremely smart and clever. You still get the same scene where Superman randomly shows up in Niagara Falls to save a kid conveniently while Clark is absent. And so it makes Lois start to second guess what happened when she jumped out the window and everything, and she starts to think Clark is Superman again. However, while they're in their honeymoon suite, she decides to prove her point again. But this time, she's not going to put herself in danger. She's going to put Clark in danger. And she points a gun at Clark Kent in the honeymoon suite. And then, to prove her point, she fires the gun, which forces Clark to reveal himself as Superman. However, the very clever part, the part that I love the most out of this scene, is that she fired a blank.
If you'd been wrong, Clark Kent would have been killed.
With a blank? Gotcha.
I think the honeymoon suites in Niagara Falls that were in the Richard Donner cut are among Margot Kidder and Christopher Reeve's best acting performances I've ever seen. Out of any of these Superman movies, out of any of the movies I've seen any of them in outside of Superman, they give their best performances in a Richard Donner cut. So their best performances aren't even in the theatrical cut. Some other differences include when Superman chooses to give up his powers to live a human life with Lois. In the theatrical cut, Superman is arguing with his mom, Laura, played by Susanna York, while in the Donner cut, he's arguing with Marlon Brando's Jor-El. Likewise, when he regains his powers, in the theatrical cut, it's mostly off-screen, and he kind of just randomly shows up again with his powers, whereas in the Donner cut, he rummages through the remnants of the Fortress of Solitude until he finds a crystal that works, in which Jor-El reappears, and Marlon Brando gets an opportunity to give another great monologue as he restores Superman's powers. And now before we get to the film's ending, the story overall, as I mentioned, has primarily been the same. They might have some different scenes and different characters, but they always achieve the same outcome. So the story is that a bomb explodes in space, releasing Zod and associates from the Phantom Zone, and then Lois and Clark fall in love while pretending to be newlyweds in Niagara Falls and investigating a honeymoon racketeering scheme. This causes Clark to give up his powers so he can live a human life with Lois. Meanwhile, General Zod and his associates take control of Earth, essentially, or as they call it, Planet Houston. Superman then regains his powers, but then loses a fight in Metropolis, which causes the citizens of Metropolis to rise up and face people that are way too overpowered for them to actually beat. However, Superman eventually lures Zod and associates to the Fortress of Solitude, where he tricks them into losing their powers, while Superman retains his. Now, the endings of each cut. These are the differences that I think are fundamentally different. Whereas in the previous differences, they all accomplish the same goal, they're just slightly different in execution. Whereas the endings here are fundamentally different. Not necessarily the ending in terms of the climax, but the ending in terms of like the falling action and the fallout of the climax. The ending in the theatrical cut is seeing Clark and Lois return to the Daily Planet, and Lois now knows that Clark is Superman. However, to protect Lois, Clark erases her memory. He does this by kissing her. Now, on paper, this sounds kind of ridiculous, like, he kissed her and she just randomly forgets. And I understand that point of view. And in terms of the Richard Donner cut, we'll get to his version here, but this version I really do prefer. And I'll get into why I don't like the Richard Donner cut ending. But primarily, I prefer this one because this one, even though the movie doesn't necessarily explain it, you can explain it as like Superman had some Kryptonian Men in Black memory erasing lipstick on. It's not good, but we'll get into why I don't like Richard Donner's ending right now. If you watched my review on 1978's Superman, you know one of my ultimate pet peeves in sci-fi movies, but primarily time travel movies, and that is time traveling by rotating the Earth on its axis. I can't stand it. I think it's the stupidest form of time travel in movies. It's a form of time travel that belongs in the 1800s. It does not belong in the 1970s and 80s. So in the Richard Donner cut, while this moment isn't the climactic story beat like it is in the first Superman, he still has Superman time travel by reversing the Earth's rotation on its axis. And he does this to erase Lois's memory of his secret. But not only does he time travel to erase Lois's memory, he time travels all the way back, and so he prevents Zod and associates from ever escaping the Phantom Zone. So not only does he time travel to erase Lois's memory, he time travels to negate the entirety of the film. So the first film in 1978 was 90% phenomenal, in my opinion. And that 10% consists of a horrendous conceptualization of time travel, as well as Otis. In the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2, it is 97% phenomenal, but it also has a horrendous conceptualization of time travel, and in this version, the time travel negates the entire movie. It's the equivalent of Roseanne waking up in the series finale and realizing the entire show was a dream. It makes it feel like you just wasted the last 2 hours of your life. In conclusion, I do think both cuts make improvements on 1978 Superman. They both get a thumbs up and more from your comic book movie historian. They would both probably be my top 2 Superman movies if I were to rank them separately. But which one do I prefer? In my opinion, I think Superman 2 is just fundamentally a great movie, and I would probably give both cuts the same score. So it really just comes down to a personal preference, because I don't think it is necessarily that one is better than the other in this instance. And a caveat here, I am a huge Richard Donner fan. He's one of my favorite directors when it comes to pre-2000s movies. I'm a huge Lethal Weapon whore. I love the Lethal Weapon movies and franchise. And up until the ending, I thought the Richard Donner cut was better than the theatrical cut. However, due to another bad example of time travel and effectively erasing the events of the film, I do personally prefer the theatrical cut. If there was a cut that uses Richard Donner's opening, Richard Donner's Lois and Clark romance, and Marlon Brando, and put it in with Richard Lester's ending, I think that would be the perfect cut for Superman 2. So thanks for watching this video on Superman 2. Tell me which version you prefer in the comment section down below, and make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can join the summer of Superman, and make sure to smash that like button if you enjoyed this video, and always stay super.